Well, thank you, Deb. And I would also like to start by acknowledging the previous or the Indigenous owners of the land, past, present, and emerging. Woodford Academy. It's the most marvellous, wonderful museum. Is it on?
Yeah, it's this one here. Guys. It's funny, it's not working. They're coming.
I didn't do it.
Sorry. They're scurrying around there. Something's going on. Jackie, could you ask them that it's sorry, everybody. Just bear with.
You never know when it's going to strike. I can start anyway. These slides, we can catch up when they are working.
There we go.
Very good.
Oh, okay.
Hopefully it'll work this when I need to change. Woodford Academy, it's in the Blue Mountains, it's on the highway. Many of you would know it driving past of it. Some of you, I would hope, have visited it. We do have a number of people in the audience. We've got volunteers, and we've got a museum advisor, and we've also got a new volunteer I've just been chatting with out in the lunch area, who have all working at Woodford and have a similar love and respect for it that I hold. Now, okay, I'll just go back. Yes, so beautiful sandstone building. Its history, is many layered. It was started off in the 1840s as an inn. It was a gentleman's residence around the mid-century. It was a school at the turn of the 19th, 20th century. And throughout the 20th century, until it came into the custodianship of the National Trust, it was the home of Jessie and Gertie McManamy, who were the daughters of the schoolmaster and his wife, who ran it as a school in the first part of the 20th century. Now, I'm not going to spend much time on the history of the house. If there's time at the end of the presentation, we may well come back to it. And I'm not the expert on the history, I must confess, but we do have the experts in the audience. So we'll see if we've got time for some further information if you're interested. But basically, I've put these slides up to show you just the historical fabric of the house, which is still there, which still relates back to those very early periods and eras of its existence. So we have on your left at the lower, that's the bakehouse, and on the right, that's the boys' washroom in the section that is at the back of the house. We also have a fabulous schoolroom set up in what is the oldest section of the house. Now, not only do we have these wonderful original fabrics and structures, but we also have an awful lot of the movable heritage still there from all the different eras. So in this case, the desks, and you can see from that top slide, we had some rather students that went on to become rather well known. That was the son of Sir John Sulman, and I think it was Tom Sulman, and he was a very well-known identity in the racing industry. We also have the boys' lockers still in place in the schoolroom. So fascinating that we still have these relics of the past use of the place. Moving through the house, this is we're standing in what was the tap room, which relates to the inn. Over the doorway, you can see a cartouche, which was uncovered during the restoration process back in, I think it was the 1980s, when the Trust started to restore the building. Marvellous cartouche, which has been researched by Kate O'Neill, who is here today, and as I said, we can perhaps come back and talk a bit more about the history if we've time. Looking through into what was the ladies' parlour, and then the slide on your right is in the ladies' parlour and the staircase going upstairs to what are the in-bedrooms, and they're pretty much still in original condition as well. So fantastic, as I said, preservation of those fabrics, those as long with the objects. Now, some of those objects in the slides aren't provenance to the place, they're there as props, but on the right you can see the remains of the cane furniture. They are provenanced items. Now, obviously they're in very poor condition, but we are hopefully working with a vast amount of the collection which isn't in such poor condition, which will be able to be preserved. Now, what this slide also shows you is what I'm really here to talk about today, which is that the issue that we had with this property, which was what you might call a wicked problem, and that was the long-standing infestation of pests. Back in the 2000s, when they were doing the second wave of restorations, they had some funding come through, I think, with the Federation celebrations. Pests were identified, and there was some strategies then to deal with the borer infestation, but they weren't successful. And you can see in that slide on the right, if you look at the floor, there is evidence of the borer. That room was actually deliberately left pretty much untouched as a bit of a time capsule to show what the place was like, but we shouldn't have left the borers there as well. The wallpaper on the walls, absolute, paradise for silverfish. They were infested, a wonderful environment for them, and that wallpaper is still steadily flaking off the walls up there, and it's something that's in the next stage that we will be addressing, is just what to do with this wonderful room that is a time capsule, that has this incredible amount of original fabrics, but really is unstable and a source, potentially, a risk of reinfestation to the rest of the house for the silverfish particularly. So we've got, as I said, a wicked problem. It wasn't that we didn't know we had issues at Woodford, but it wasn't until the volunteers successfully got a grant from Museums and Galleries for a preservation needs assessment, which was undertaken by Tegan Anthers, who's also here today. So Tegan's report really put down in black and white the issues that had to be addressed. I came on board, I suppose, a year or so prior to that report being pulled together. I've got 20 odd properties around the state. Not all of them are in a state as drastic as what Woodford was, but there were certainly lots of competing demands. But Tegan's report really pulled the attention of the Trust to Woodford, and we really couldn't allow it to go on. But where to start? That really was the question. We started with I'll just go back. We started with as I said, with Tegan's report. We did a walkthrough, and we had the wonderful advantage of having the Powerhouse Museum conservator, Kate Chidlow, who just lives a block away from Woodford. She volunteered to come down one afternoon, and together we walked through with Tegan's report. And basically she said, well, look, there's a lot of paper, where there was a whole, beneath that room there was a storeroom which was full of paper-based materials, records, some textiles, not a huge amount of textiles, but it also was infested with the silverfish. So she said, how about we get all this material tubbed up, take it away and get that frozen. So that was the starting point. Once we did that, and that took 3 or 4 months, and a lot of work by the volunteers involved. And we had the advantage of one of those volunteers, Kate O'Neill, who was able to use, she had some, the advantage of being able to be seconded to work on the museum while her day job were giving her some leave. So that's another story, but it was a great advantage to have her regularly a day a week at the museum working, and we employed a project officer to work with her to pack up all the paper and textile-based materials. They were taken off and treated. The next step was to get in Alex Roach, who's a pest specialist. Now, Alex is, he's well known, I suspect, to many of you, but certainly he knows everything in and out to do with pests. But Alex certainly, when we were asking him, can we bring our collection back? We've had it frozen. What do we need to do to make the house safe? He basically came in and gave us a report that was almost identical to the one he'd given us 20 years before, which was it's infested with borer. And he identified, and this slide was taken actually in February, which is the following summer when we started the project, but you will see if you look at the block, the frass, which is falling out of the door, which is the borer. So that was just one example. It was throughout the house, it was obviously active. So Alex basically told us that we didn't really have a choice. There had been, back in 2000 when he'd written his previous report, there were other alternative treatments we could have tried. They were highly toxic, and now anyway they're not available. He'd been long advocating this heat treatment, this holistic, where you heat the entire building up to a temperature which will kill the bugs. He'd tried to talk a few organisations into doing it over the years. No one had actually taken the risk, I suppose, because it is where the temperatures had to get to 56 degrees Celsius in the core of the timbers in the building. It's pretty hot. You'll see in a few minutes we got a lot hotter. We did it in February. We decided to go ahead with this. The money was raised through a public campaign, which was absolutely fantastic, and we were suddenly in a position to actually go ahead with the project. We scheduled it for February. There was a few concerns about it being the bushfire season, but then we realised that actually it might actually work for our advantage, because in the middle of February, the roof at least of the house is going to be up on those temperatures anyway. So we weren't going to have to put so much energy in getting the temperature up to what we needed, the target. So there's Alex in the middle, looking for pests, as he does so well, and he finds. And on your right, there's Kate Chidlow and Alex having a look in the piano, which was, of course, in fact, it's got borer in it as well. But on your left were the wonderful volunteers, and this was when the work really started. So we had to pack up the house, and that was a huge project that involved the volunteers working tirelessly over. This was almost, as I said, they'd already packed all the books and textiles up. So this was now looking at we had to expose the floors. I mean, the carpets we left in the house for the heat treatment, but they couldn't be on the boards. We had to allow the boards to heat up. We had to pick furniture that we decided was able to be left, had to be picked up off the board so the heat could get in underneath it. So the process of deciding what could be left and what couldn't be was one that did take a bit of time, and we did get some specialist advice in the end with the furniture. So things that were solid timber, such as the desks, they're fine. Things that are glued, have many parts, they're not. So the harmonium had to go out, couldn't be in the room when the heat was being applied, but the desks could stay. The only thing is, when we did get the furniture conservator to come through and just check that we'd made the right decisions, he did say, well, take the screws out, because that wooden desk is screwed onto a metal frame. And we needed to take the screws out down one side to allow it to expand and contract. So the basic principle is you could leave things in place that were able to expand and contract, but things that were put at risk with that process had to go out. So what to do with the things that weren't going to be heat treated? Because this was a holistic project, we couldn't just treat the house. We couldn't just treat the books and paper. We had to treat everything. Okay, also we had to protect things, so that's where the cartouche, obviously we couldn't take that out of the building. Obviously it is vulnerable, so what they did was they simply covered it with padding and plastic and gave a barrier so that the heat wasn't going to be impeding straight onto it. And I did document the house thoroughly. I did get a photographer in to take photos of everything that looked like damage or surfaces, so that we had a baseline to go back and check what we ended up with against. And I'm very pleased to say that we haven't found any significant change in the material fabric of the house that we could put down to the heat treatment process. So what couldn't be heated up had to go into a low oxygen tent, a nitrogen tent. Now, we did the heat treatment in stages. There's, it's a complex. This is a large building with several outbuildings. So we started at one end of the building. We did 2 or 3 rooms in a group. And once we'd done that first section, we then established an oxygen tent in that room. And into that oxygen tent went all the objects that the volunteers had carefully wrapped and removed from the rooms, the things that we thought would not be able to withstand the heat, things like the harmonium, the paintings that had glued or lacquer or laminations, things along of that nature. The heat actually was diesel engines, heaters, heated the air with fans that blew the air into the house. Those large ducting, as you can see, lots of tarps to seal off and contain the heat into the rooms or the target areas. Okay, so some results. What we have up here is the McManamy room, which is a room in the middle of the house. What I've done is, you can see the graph on the back. Now, I should actually note, I put data loggers in the room for my records. The way this process worked was they had probes in the room in pieces of timber that were about the size of the timber that we needed to make sure we were penetrating. So once those probes got to this 56 degrees, this is the timber in the room with the probes in them, then we knew we'd got to target. The gentlemen who were doing the process work with customs. They had never done a historic house or a complex before, but they certainly were very experienced with heating up large objects to kill pests. So these are my records, and I tended to put my data loggers in some different spots. So I'll explain what I mean by that when we get to it. But here you can see we got to, it was a period 2.3% humidity, relative humidity. Now that's extraordinarily low, and I have presented this information to a group of conservators and they went white when I said this. This was the most extreme example of how low the relative humidity went, and we hit 80 degrees in this case. Now that's an awful lot hotter than the 56 degrees, but the temperatures within the rooms went hotter because we had to soak that temperature into the timbers themselves. So this was an object that we left in place in this room, the McManamy room. It did have the inlaid leather on the desktop. The strategy we used there was to put a weight on it. It protected it from some of the heat. It also helped because what happens is the glues will melt, but then they'll re-adhere as it cools off. So putting weights on things was one of the strategies that we felt. One of the biggest risks we came across was actually moving fragile, large pieces of furniture. The moving was likely to cause more damage than the actual heat, so we had to balance that out. So you can see here there's a bit of a summary. It got up to 80 degrees, we got down to 2.3. There were 4 hours that it was above 45 degrees and 2 hours that it was above the target of 56 degrees. So in the ladies' lounge, we only got down to the 10% relative humidity, but we got the 60 degrees temperature, so well and truly into that range. This piano was left in place. It is in appalling condition. It was riddled with borer. In the end, we made the decision that moving it would be more risky than leaving it in place. It certainly wasn't a piano that's usable in any sense of the word. You can see that it was 3 hours above the 45 degrees Celsius. There was some lost 2 keys came adrift, and when they were examined by the conservator, we realised they were re-stuck. They had already been loose and had been re-adhered. That was really the only obvious damage to this object to go through those temperatures. The tap room, we hit only 51s now, depending on where I put my data logger, and sometimes I stuck it inside cabinets and things like that. It didn't necessarily show the temperature that the room got to, but you can see here that we did get up to around the target temperature. And the bookcase in the tap room. Now, this bookcase we decided to leave in place. It was so big, so heavy, and it was very solidly constructed, not laminated. We felt it was a reasonable risk, but it had to go up onto timber pegs to lift it off the floorboards to allow the heat to get in underneath it. Now, it was the lifting, it was one of the few objects that we did notice had some impact from the heat, and that was the crack down the side had opened slightly. Not hugely, but it had, the records I kept was that it had opened it slightly. Now, what happened afterwards was we actually worked out that it was probably more a result of us pulling it down off the pegs too soon. The heat, it had heated up. We had the two, men from the removalists coming up the next day to put everything back in place, and we'd actually taken it down. We should have left it a week before we tried to move it back down onto the ground. So that was one of the lessons learned. Upstairs, once again, we got to these temperatures. I'm rushing a bit now because I know I'm running out of time. Okay, so this is the last slide and the summary. So you can see what we had was, these are the objects down the side here, this is what the conditions they went through. So basically, they varied a bit. Sometimes we got up to temperature a lot quicker for some of those rooms than others. The target temperature was held, for a variety of times, from 20 minutes to 2.5 hours. And then the relative humidity varied, but it was, all of it was pretty low. I mean, 20% is still pretty low relative humidity, and that was the highest that we were recording for when we hit temperature. And some of the temperatures are quite high. And as you can see, as I said, some of the data loggers were inside cabinets and things, which explains some of the variation. So what we have learned, nothing catastrophic happened, amazingly. There is often more risk in moving things out of the rooms than leaving them in place for a treatment of this sort. So it is a matter of being very careful about assessing what you've got to do and what you've got to move. The impact, as I just said, of moving the large furniture too soon. So that's probably one of the risks that really does need to be kept in mind. And then finally, and I think most importantly, how do we measure our success? Bora will live inactive for 5 years inside timber. We've got 5 years, well, so almost a year. We've just done the first spring inspection. We're looking for signs of activity of pests. I can say, touch wood, that we found no evidence of live borer or active borer. There are some silverfish moving back into the house, but we need to address those areas and we need to get onto them reasonably quickly, and that's in process. The volunteers there have developed an integrated pest management plan, which will involve what basically has to happen is observation and response as appropriate. We need to keep an eye on what's coming into the museum. We need to be very careful about introducing the pests. Whether or not the borer has survived, we could easily introduce them if we're not careful. And it is just the beginning, in other words. So it's, at least 5 years of checking every spring to see if we've got evidence of borer, and it's not going to stop then, of course, because this is an ongoing process. So, thank you.
While you're gathering your thoughts to ask questions, that's a really interesting project and fascinating to see the damage or non-damage is incredible. So are there any questions from the audience? We've got mics, don't forget to speak into them. We have a gentleman up there.
Rebecca, could you just tell us a little bit more about what your feeling is as a result of all your efforts and work? I know you're going to do monitoring in the future, but what feedback have you got so far as to how successful it's been?
Look, in a personal, I suppose, response, I'm absolutely delighted with the project. I didn't mention that we also, in tandem, there was a grant application put in for the building maintenance to museums and galleries, and that was successful. So we weren't only dealing with the pests, we were actually repairing the roof and the gutters, we were stopping the water getting in. That's ongoing, and I'm not sure that we've actually finished all those basic repairs. But we have ended up with a museum, because it's been cooked, and we've stopped the water coming in, it now has a lovely dry sense of its atmosphere. And it used to smell mouldy, it used to be damp. So it totally changed the environment when you walk into that building. There's still a lot of work to be done. You know, we need to return. The process of returning the objects has really only just got into gear. There's a lot of work involved. The volunteers there, as you know, Kay was talking about the disaster recovery. It is something you have to, you know, you've got to keep a pace that people can keep up with. So it's not a quick process, and we have to be very careful about bringing things back in that aren't going to recontaminate the building. So I think we've actually scored a real win. But it's not the end of the story.
What pests does it target? Like, is there a range of pests that it targets?
All of them. Pretty much. The 56 degrees Celsius will kill all insects. The biology of them is that they lose their capacity, they lose the moisture out of their bodies.
And what about the eggs? Like they're not going?
It kills eggs as well. Yeah, that's where the 56 degrees, I think they have a target of holding it at an hour or something like that. And the technicians were trying to saturate the house, so they were sort of doubling that at least. And the 56 is actually well over the point of death, I might add. It's actually allowing a lot of leeway there for the fact that we might not get the temperature up to scale, you know, in the corner of the room or in the floorboards or in the... because we did take up floorboards as well, and the heat was pumped in under the floor as well, and it was pumped into the roof. But, you know, there were places where you couldn't get the heat, and we did have to have some areas treated in a more traditional manner, because we had, you know, there was plaster that was too delicate that would not respond well to the heat. So there was a mixture, but basically the parameters that we set and used would kill all the pests.
And is this, you said that it's been used in customs before, but in terms of museums, has there been any others that you know of?
Not that I know of. It's actually interesting. Alex, who was the one who'd been promoting this because he constantly comes across issues in old houses like this where he'll treat certain things, but he knows when he comes back in 12 months' time or in 2 years' time, they're going to have that problem again. There wasn't any real answer to this issue. And he had, when he was overseas in his younger days, back in the 80s and the 90s, he had worked with firms in the UK and in Europe who did do this heat treating, and they do it in America as well, I gather, but it hadn't actually been done in Australia.
And, sorry, taking over, but cost?
Look, we raised, I think they put aside about $45,000 to pay for the cost. There probably was a bit more than that, and certainly that doesn't cover the in-kind. But that did cover the treatment and, you know, the various treatments that we did, which was the low oxygen and the heat treatment. The cost of moving things around, you know, transport, packing, and as I said, the in-kind, that would be additional.
Where you have silverfish reinfesting after the treatment, what are you looking at to deal with those?
Okay, we're putting out baits, we're putting out sticky traps so that we know really early that we've got silverfish back, and we have got them back, especially in that room up where the wallpaper is. We treat, you know, you're never going to keep them all out. So it's a constant process of responding to them. So the sticky traps, Alex will always do an immediate treatment along the floorboards, the spaces where they run, and we have to keep that up every year. So where we find evidence of them, we do that treatment, but as long as we get onto them quickly and early, then I don't think we're going to have that sort of conditions that we got before.
And very last.
I was just...
What was the time frame for the...
For the whole project, it was about 10 days that I stayed close nearby, and it was, you know, 8 o'clock in the morning till 6 o'clock at night. They worked their way through the building methodically. We did have the weekends off, which was fabulous. But yes, that was just the heating of the building. The work to pack it all up would have been 12 months probably. with volunteers and the nature of the organisation.